If you would, turn your Bibles to John 13, to the Gospel of John, chapter 13. It's good to be with you this morning and for the next few days. It's been a long time since I've been at Saraland, probably 25 years ago, but I'm so glad to be back with you all and in this gospel meeting. And I'm glad to have my wife, Vicki, with me on this trip. And I'm just glad to be with you all. We certainly are disappointed that we're not with Ken and Dee Dee. We've known them for many years, and we were looking forward to our time together. And we've had some good times in the past, and just pray that they get better. Of course, I know Ken is the one that's really been dealing with the COVID, now with pneumonia. And so he told me last night that I asked him how he felt. He said, "I'm just tired." And that's something that really happens to people that are affected by this disease. My wife and I both have been through it, and we know what that's about. And some of you might have as well. But this morning, I'd like for a study from John 13, verse 1 through 17. If you would, just follow along as I read this from the Gospel of John. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel, and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, "Lord, are you washing my feet?" Jesus answered and said to him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you." For he knew who would betray him. Therefore he said, "You are not all clean." So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." Some religious groups practice foot washing as part of their worship service. Foot washing was never done as an act of worship to God in the New Testament. Foot washing, as we read in the New Testament, was an act of service to man. It was the mark of a godly widow. We can read what Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5, saying that was one of the marks of a godly widow, washing feet. But hear what Jesus is doing. He is talking to his apostles about their conduct toward one another. It was not good what he saw and he noticed was what was going on. That they were arguing over greatness in the kingdom. I'd like for you to notice with me in a passage here in Mark 9, verse 33 through 35. I think I need to back up here there it is. This is the one I want you to see. Mark 9, verse 33 through 35. Then he came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, What was it you disputed among yourselves on the road? But they kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves. Now Jesus is talking to his apostles. Here they were arguing, they were disputing who would be the greatest in the kingdom. And he sat down, he called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. He taught that greatness in his kingdom did not consist of ruling, but serving. I mean, he is the example of service here. Jesus himself, the Son of God, imagine this. The Son of God stooping down to wash the feet of his disciples. But he found contentment in doing that. He found fulfillment in doing that. He considered it a privilege, a joy to do this. And we should follow the example of Jesus. You know, people so often are so unhappy. There are people that you may know that seem to be just filled with gloom and doom, and nothing is just going right for them in life, and they just seem to be very unhappy. And so a lot of times the problem is, and maybe we've all had this has happened to us, but when we focus so much on ourselves, and we tend to neglect others around us, and we are so self-centered, we're not going to be happy. We're not going to be happy at all. We live in a society that really encourages that it's all about me. I'm number one. But we're not. Benjamin Franklin, one of our founding fathers, was asked to define the American religion. And he said, first of all, there is a God. And then he said, and the best way to serve God is to serve others. But Jesus taught that principle. We see it right here in John 13, don't we? Compare the apostles' behavior to that of Jesus. Again, we find this in the other Gospels as well, even in Luke, in regards to the dispute that was going on among them. They were in competition with one another. And here's Jesus about to leave this earth and to go on. And after he had spent 3.5 years of his ministry here on earth, and he's preparing these men to go out after he leaves, and yet he notices something going on that's not good. They're just not treating each other right. That they needed a lesson in regards to humility. They were not humble. He was, and he shows that to them. But as we look at John 13 again, in the first 3 verses here of John 13, verse 1 and verse 2 and verse 3, here are some things that Jesus knew. First of all, he knew that his time on earth was winding down. But then he also knew his enemies. Judas, one of his own, and the Sanhedrin council. But he also knew his identity, that he was from God, and that he was going to go back to God. And here on earth he was God in the flesh. But he knew this. These fellows that I selected to be apostles are feuding with one another. And with all that in mind, he looked beyond, due to his love to the end. And that is the heart, the model of a servant. This is the heart of a servant that we see in Jesus. It's the model that we all should follow ourselves. So I want us to look here in the next few moments about why this kind of heart and how we might make it practical as we look at this type of service. First of all, this type of service doesn't worry about my rights. We hear so much about that, don't we? About people's rights being violated. You know, most of the lawsuits that happen today and have happened for years and years have because someone felt their rights had been violated. But this type of service does not worry about my rights. With this type of service, we might have to stoop to others' problems and get grime and dirt and filth on our hands. I may be prepared all day to have this very super meal at night at supper time, and a hot meal, and I sit down to it, and all of a sudden a phone call comes, or someone maybe in the neighborhood, or someone needs something, and I may have to just stop and drop what I'm doing because of my concern for others. And my supper might get cold. And my feet might get dirty. But the service that we offer to God and to others must be with the proper spirit. And Paul taught this in Ephesians. As a matter of fact, we find this written in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5 through 7, where he says, "Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good and goodwill doing, or with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men." We also find in Romans 12, verse 10 through 11, "Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love and honor, giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord." I'd like for you to notice in Matthew 25. In Matthew chapter 25, so often we'll turn to this and we'll read about this. And of course, toward the end here, we see this, the difference between the sheep and the goats and the separation of the two. But I'd like to begin in verse 34. In Matthew 25, verse 34, Jesus said, "Then the king will say to those on his right hand, 'Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me.' Then the righteous will answer him, saying, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?' And the king will answer and say to them, 'Surely I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to the one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me.' And then he will also say to those on the left hand, 'Depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not take me in. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me.' Then they will also answer him, saying, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to you?' And then he will answer them, saying, 'Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life.'" The point he's making here, that when we serve others, we serve him. When we neglect others, we neglect him. So it's all about giving attention to others. And that's what Paul and what Jesus is trying to get across to these men that have been following him, that he's sitting there with at the supper that evening. What else do we learn about this type of service? Not only do we find that it doesn't worry about my rights, but it doesn't expect anything in return. Does not expect to be served in return. No one washed the feet of Jesus in this story, in John 13. Not at all. He didn't ask for it, and if he had asked for it, that would not be service. But here's what we find in John 13. He says, "For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you." What Jesus wanted to do with them, he sought to start a trend. He wanted them to follow a pattern, to follow his example. But here's something else we learn about this type of service. It doesn't wait for others. It doesn't wait for others. It goes first. It doesn't wait. And in this story in John 13, we find that Jesus is the only one who gets up to do anything. And you just imagine if you were there in the room, observing what's going on here. Here is this one getting up and doing this while the rest of them are fussing with one another. Did anyone even notice Jesus getting up? With the towels and the water basin? I mean, anyone can look around and see things that need to be done and wait for others to begin. But this servant, or the servant himself, just doesn't look. He gets up and does it. And I think another thing that really ties in with this is that this type of service will serve alone, even if no one else gets involved. We don't read it all where Jesus said, as we were reading in John 13 a while ago, where he said, hey, Peter, would you help me out here? James, John, Matthew, would you help me out? You know, sometimes we can look around and see things that we personally see that maybe ought to be done in the kingdom. When it comes to God's work, say, you know, this really ought to be done. Somebody ought to do this. And then wait for somebody to start. Jesus didn't do that. Just gets up and he does it. And he does it alone. And sometimes we may get really enthusiastic about something and we'll say, well, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyway. This is something I think is a good idea, and yet you may find that others don't get on board with you on it. And it can be discouraging, and your enthusiasm can cool. And you can start to get kind of upset about it. But when you think about what Jesus did, he just went ahead and he served those men, and he served them alone. Again, why? He wanted them to see what was going on. I liked what I read years ago about a football coach that in a school where I grew up. But later, after we had moved away, and I heard about this football team, it was really a great team, but a lot of it had to do with the coach on the team. And what he trained his assistant coaches to do, he would tell them that you cannot coach anybody at all until you have built a relationship with them. You know what? You've got to let those young men that are under your leadership know that you care about them. And he said you have to serve before you can lead. Whereas Jesus was leading these men, but he was willing to serve them. I'll say more about that in just a moment. But what is our motivation? Our motivation is to please the Lord. That's ultimately our motivation. It should be. We read a while ago in Romans 12, verse 10 and 11, that in honor give preference to one another, serving the Lord. And so we see in his example, I'll serve even if no one else serves with me. And that's the type of service that we see on Jesus' part. And that it does work. But what else can we find? This type of service doesn't expect a favorable response. It's not the type of service that's looking for recognition. I do believe that Jesus he wanted them to notice what he's doing and for them to pay attention to what he was doing, because they certainly needed a lesson on humility. And there was no one more humble than Jesus himself. We saw that all through his life, all through his ministry. We see that all the way up to his death on the cross. But his apostles didn't understand. I mean, Peter objected to it. I mean, when I look at that, and I was reading it again this morning, going through it several times, and I just thought about what Peter says. Lord, you washing my feet? I mean, you know anything about Peter and his character, you kind of expect that from him. That was sort of his nature. He's the one that would speak up, wouldn't he? I mean, we read over in Matthew 26, where he even rebuked Jesus. And then Jesus had to say, get behind me, Satan. I mean, that was over in Matthew. But here we find in John, where Simon Peter, he says, you shall never wash my feet. Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." I believe that we can also see that there's a spiritual connection here as well, that they're not quite getting it. But he wanted them to get the physical part of it. Understand that you need to serve one another and love one another. Matter of fact, I was reading a little bit further over in John 13, verse 34 this morning. A new commandment, Jesus said, "I give to you that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another, and by this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Can you imagine them trying to go out and carry on the ministry of Jesus and not have love for one another? And this would have been shown in the fact that they were disputing with one another. Who wants to follow them? They could not have carried on the ministry of Jesus without learning this important lesson. You know, some may not recognize what you're doing or may be critical. But our response is, I'm going to serve anyway. I'm going to serve anyway. And he did that even when they didn't understand what he was doing. Matter of fact, that was read in John 13 a while ago as well. Verse 7, "What I am doing, you do not understand now, but you will know after this." You will know. I mentioned to someone one time, a friend of mine, that was, he was a doer. Grass didn't grow under his feet. I mean, he was always wanting to do something. And I said, you know, one of these days, I know you haven't been here very long in where we are in the congregation here, but one of these days you ought to be serving as a deacon and serving. And he said, "Oh, I don't need to have the position to serve." And he's right. We all can serve. Every one of us can. I mean, one person I remember so well that was in her 80s that was going out every Sunday afternoon. She asked me one time, she said, "Would you make me about 30 copies, extra copies of the bulletin?" And I said, "Why do you want that many copies?" "Well, because I want to go and hand them out to my neighbors and go to the nursing home and hand them out and let people read the article that's in the bulletin and just let them know what's going on." She's in her 90s now, and as far as I know, she's still doing that. But she found something to do. No one asked her to do it. She just thought, "I want to do this." You know, I think another thing we need to see here about this type of service, it's not just reserved for my friends. It's easy to serve people that you know them well, they're your friends, you're close to them, they're close to you, and you enjoy being together, and you don't mind doing things for them. But this type of service is not just reserved for our friends. I mean, in this group, imagine there is a person sitting there at the table who is about to betray you, who's already received money from the Sanhedrin and looking for the opportune time to turn you over to the Sanhedrin council. And yet Jesus elevated his enemies who pretended to be his friends, and he washes the feet of Judas as he washed the feet of Peter and James and John, all those men. And we too must be willing to serve our enemies. And that's easier said than done, isn't it? Notice with me in Matthew 5, going back to the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, in verse 43 through 47. Matthew 5, verse 43 through 47. Here's what Jesus taught. Again, greatest sermon ever preached. He says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brother and your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? Therefore, you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. You shall be complete, fulfilled. And notice another one in Romans 12. In Romans chapter 12, verse 17 through 21. Romans 12, verse 17 through 21. I read a few moments ago from Romans 12, but I'll read a little bit farther down now at verse 17 and read through verse 21. Romans 12, verse 17 through 21. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. This is coming from Proverbs, by the way, but he's quoting it from Proverbs 25. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I mean, if you stop to help somebody who's you may consider your enemy or someone you're not fond of, and you do something nice for them, it's going to get their attention. It may shock them to see that you're doing something for them. And I would come home, and my mother used that expression a lot whenever I had any issue with anybody at school, with a teacher, or whomever it might have been. I'd come home and I'd tell my mother, I just don't care much for this person. And my mother would say, son, be kind, tenderhearted, heap coals of fire on their head. And my response was, if I could, I would. She said, that's not what I'm talking about. But the thing is, when we do such a thing, when we have a conduct like that towards someone, the wrongdoer, for example, it may lead that wrongdoer to becoming a right doer. It may lead that person to repentance. It may save that person. But they see that in your conduct. They see that in your behavior. And that's what he's trying to get across. I mean, folks, it's hard to serve a pretender. Someone who appears to be with you, but yet plotting against you. Like Judas was plotting against Jesus. But yet Jesus was willing to stoop down and wash the feet of a hypocrite. And maybe they come around. In his case, he didn't. He still betrayed his Lord. In that garden that night, the one that Judas kissed was the one he was betraying. A kiss of betrayal. But I hope that we can see the good that can come from this. Others will take notice. They will notice this and see something that maybe they want in life to be like. But I think I learned another thing from this is what God and Christ have done for me. He stoops to wash the grime of sin off of me. He did it for all of us. Willing to go to the cross, and we'll talk about that in the next hour. But he had the servant's heart, and so must I. And then here's the final point. The final point I wanted to share with you, this type of service you're going to look like a servant. You think about it. If you were walked in that room and there was these men there, these 13 men, 12 apostles and Jesus, and you say, who's the servant here? You could look and see, well, I can see who the servant is. That's the one that's down on his knees washing feet. The one that, imagine somebody stooping down and washing somebody's dirty feet. He looked like a servant. But don't be surprised to be treated like one. You think about later, after Jesus was betrayed that night, and he went before these men that despised him, that wanted to put him to death, and he went to the cross. Where did these men, the remaining men, go? They fled, didn't they? They fled. But I'll tell you something. What I believe is that these men would never, ever forget this scene that happened in John 13. They would always remember that, of what Jesus did. And the reason why he did it was to bring them together to have love and concern for one another. But when we take on the role of a servant and we look like one and treat like one, don't be surprised to be questioned about, why did you do that? Maybe criticized for something. Maybe there's something you think, this is a good idea, and then someone criticizes you. That hurts, doesn't it? Or maybe expected to do everything. Not appreciated. But when you adopt the role of a servant, be prepared. But then, I come back to that final verse we read a while ago in John 13. Jesus said, if you know these things, and really, let me just maybe use another term instead of if you know these things. Knowing is understanding. If you understand these things, blessed are you if you do them. That's the type of service. But the blessing is in doing it. Doing it. And learning and practicing what Jesus did. When we learn what is revealed here in John 13 about serving as Jesus served, we have no option but to adopt this same attitude. And I believe that Jesus put it this way to them. True contentment will follow. You'll be glad you did. You know, actually, when you take on this role and you serve someone, and again, it's someone that's not your friend, who's really in control of the situation? When we are the type that turns it around and we do this in order to try to impress upon them the importance of being humble and obeying the one who was the most humble person who ever lived, Jesus himself, you really, through your behavior, are taking control of the situation, not your enemy. We see the heart of man in John 13, but we also see the heart of God. The disciples were looking for greatness. Judas had the money and was looking for the opportune time to turn Jesus over to the Sanhedrin. A lot of things were on people's minds that day. They had an agenda, those men did, didn't they? Thinking of themselves, but Jesus had weightier matters on his mind. He knew that he was getting ready to go to the cross. He knew that was about to happen. But who's he thinking of here? Not himself. He's thinking of them. And God thinks about you when you don't think about him. And so that's the lesson this morning. And I have a song that you probably are familiar with, the servant song. And I thought in the closing few minutes here, I would sing this song, or have us sing it together, because it ties in so well with this lesson this morning from John 13. Holy, make me a 4-verse psalm, but I've only picked out 2, and it's called Others. Lord, help me live from day to day in such a self-forgetful way that even when I kneel to pray, my prayers shall be for others. Others, Lord, yes, others. Let this my motto be. Help me to live for others, that I may live like thee. Help me in all the work I do, to ever be sincere and true, and know that all I do for you must needs be done for others. Others, Lord, yes, others. Let this my motto be. Help me to live for others, that I may live like thee. I hope the lesson will be helpful to you, as I know it's studying this and going over this. It's helpful to me to be reminded of these things of serving one another. And what better example we have than him in that last verse right there, last part, the last phrase, that I may live like him, that I may live like thee. The psalm before, make me a servant just like your son. And so this hopefully will be helpful to you in your day-to-day walk as we continue on through this life. This is what pleases God. But there's a number of things that pleases him, but we hear so much about love that we are to have for one another, and the love that we're to have for all mankind. In an effort, hopefully, to lead those people, lead them to Christ, so that they can have a relationship with him, and so we can enjoy that hope together of one day being in heaven for eternity. Thank you all for your attention this morning, and I'll close that at this time.